The following program, Search the Scriptures, is brought to you by the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. Speakers are Keith Sharp and Trevor Campbell. We invite you to call or write the church to submit questions for the speakers to answer. We'll provide answers from the Bible to your questions.
Trevor, where did God come from?
That's a good question. I believe God exists.
Okay, we'll talk about that this evening on the program. Thank you for watching Search the Scriptures. I'm Keith Sharp. I preach at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ in Mountain Home. With me is my partner, Trevor Campbell. Trevor, introduce yourself, please, and the folks in Payette.
Sure, yeah. My name is Trevor Campbell, and I do preach and worship with the brethren that meet there in Payette on Highway 62 on the north side of the highway. We're very easy to find there, right next to the new Dollar General. Pretty easy to locate us. And if you're in the Marion County area, you can come and join us for Bible class or worship service on Sunday mornings. Bible class is at 10 a.m. It's an open discussion of the Word of God. And then worship at 10:45 a.m. And also on the screen, you're going to see my phone number, 870-435-2737. And you can call me at that number. That number is good to call me at if you have a question for this program that you'd like Keith and I to discuss, a Bible question, or if you have questions about the church that meets there in Payette. Feel free to give me a call.
You folks over in Marion County, be sure and be in touch with Trevor and let him know what your questions are. And also, stop by and worship with them, and you'll be benefited by doing that. Now, for those of you who live in Baxter County, of course, I preach at the Highway 5 South Church of Christ, 1 mile south of the Highway 62-412 bypass on the way to Salesville. We invite you to stop and worship with us. We have our Sunday morning Bible class at 10 o'clock. We have our worship assembly at 11 o'clock. And then at 2 o'clock on Sunday afternoon, we have another worship service. We have a Wednesday evening service at 7 o'clock. You're invited to all of these. During December, our women's class is not meeting, but in January it will start again. They're still studying prayer. And so you ladies remember that in January to come to the ladies' Bible class at 10 o'clock on Wednesday morning. We invite you to all of these services. If you have questions for me, Keith Sharp, then you can be in touch with me by calling 870-321-5746. Or if you prefer, you can email me at keithsharp2021@gmail.com. Or you can write, if you prefer, to Post Office Box 263 in Mountain Home, 72654. Let us know what your question is. Your questions generate the subject matter on this program. So far, we've been very successful in always having questions from those who watch the program. We've never just had to come up with a subject matter ourselves. So there may be things I want to talk about, but we're going to talk about what you want to talk about, those of you who are watching the program. We have a question before us this evening. It's an unusual question, but I believe it's an excellent question. The question is, how is God just there? Well, Trevor, tell us all about that, please.
Well, it is. It's a good question, the existence of God. And the first passage that I would like to go with is Psalm 90. And it's a brief passage, but nonetheless, it does teach us some good things here. Psalm 90, this is a prayer of Moses. It's a psalm. And beginning of verse 1, it says, "Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or ever you had formed the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." So this verse teaches us that God has no beginning and God has no end. He is from everlasting and to everlasting. Now, that is difficult for you and I to get our minds around because, you know, as individuals on this earth, we see that there's a beginning and an end to all of us, at least in this life, in this earthly life. There's a beginning and an end. We see little babies being born, and of course we see aged men pass from this life. So we see that beginning and end. In fact, Moses later on talks about you and I and how temporal our lives are. Let's see, in verse 10, he says, "The days of our lives are 70 years, and if by reason of strength they are 80 years, yet their boast is only labor and sorrow. For it is soon cut off, and we fly away. Who knows the power of your anger? For as the fear of you, so is your wrath. So teach us to number our days, that we may gain a heart of wisdom." And so Moses there kind of gives the average life span, if you will, 70 to 80 years. And then what he says, I believe in verse 12, is very important. He says, "So teach us to number our days." It is important for us to consider how temporal this life is. It was in the book of Ecclesiastes, Solomon, in chapter 7 and verse 12, or 2, 7:2, that's what it is. Ecclesiastes 7:2, that Solomon said, "It is better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will take it to heart." Now, in today's terminology, we would just say it's better to go to a funeral than a party. That's basically what Solomon was saying. And when you think about that from a spiritual aspect, that is true, because all of us are going to pass from this life. And Solomon's point was to consider that. Consider how short this life is, and that's what Moses is talking about here, and that's the end of all of us. All of us are going to pass from this life. Very important that we find ourselves at death still serving in the kingdom of God. And so we need to find our work in the kingdom of God and do that work and follow His will. So of the utmost importance. But going back to the topic here, this idea of God is from everlasting to everlasting, it's really difficult for us to get our minds wrapped around that, again, because we on this earth have a beginning and an end. And Moses did say to number your days. Teach us to number our days. Well, God created time, and God does everything that He does with a purpose. He has a purpose to all these things. Well, He created time, and part of the purpose is so that we can number our days and consider how temporal this time is that we have to serve our God and to do what is right so that we can have an everlasting home in heaven with Him. Now I want to go back just for a moment, and then I'll turn it over to you, Keith, to Genesis, just to show this point that God created time. And again, because we're bound, you and I are bound by time, while God is from everlasting to everlasting, it's very difficult for us to understand how God is just there. But God created time, and we are bound by it, at least in the moment. In Genesis chapter 1, in verse 1, it says, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters." So this beginning is not God's beginning in verse 1, but rather it is the beginning of creation, the beginning of the world. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. He goes on in verse 3 to say, "Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light. God saw the light that it was good, and God divided the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. So the evening," now catch this, "so the evening and the morning were the first day." There's day one right there. God created time. And the reason it says evening and morning is this is written by Moses, the book of Genesis, and he's writing from a Hebrew perspective. In the Hebrew culture, in their calendar, the day started at sundown, 5 o'clock is when their day started. So the evening and the morning are the first day. It seems kind of peculiar to us. We think of getting up in the morning, that's the start of your day. But the day really starts for us at midnight. For them, it started about 5 o'clock or sundown. Now, later on in the chapter, in verse 14, God creates, in day 4, He creates the sun and the moon and the stars. And He says they have a purpose. One of their purposes that He talks about here is for having a calendar, so to speak, understanding days and years and times. In verse 14, it says, "Then God said, 'Let there be lights in the firmament of the heavens, divide the day from the night. Let them be for signs and seasons and for days and years.'" And that was on day 4 that He did that. So God created time. God is from everlasting to everlasting, but He created time for us. And Moses said there in Psalm 90, that we need to consider our days. We need to, realize how temporal this life is. All right, Keith, I'll kick it back to you.
Thank you, Trevor. Really good comments, and I guess great minds in running the same way, because I had Psalm 90 verses 1 and 2 down as the first passages to look at. So great, I'm so glad you did that.
Sorry I
so
took your...
No, not at all. We've told you repeatedly, Trevor and I study independently. Then we come together, we each find what the others come up with on a topic. And that's revealing to me, hopefully it is to the audience as well. Trevor did a good job of that, and I appreciate that. And it's interesting to me that the author of Psalm 90 is Moses. Psalm 90 is the only psalm that Moses wrote. We usually think of the Psalms, but it's the only one in the book of Psalms. If you go back to the book of Exodus, there are some poems that are recorded in the way of songs that Moses wrote. And of course, that's what the Psalms are. They're poetry that can be turned into music, and they were the music of the Old Testament Israel. But nonetheless, only Psalm 90 in the book of Psalms was written by Moses, and he's the same one that the Lord appeared to in the burning bush to send him to Egypt, to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. You can read about that in Exodus chapter 3, the first half of the chapter. When Moses wanted to know who he could tell Israel was sending him to let them go, the Lord said, I am that I am. There is the self-existent nature of God. And by the way, that's unique. No other being in all the universe who's ever existed is self-existent. Only God is self-existent. All of the angels, all spirit beings, every living thing came about either by direct creation by God or as the result of God's law of procreation. God is the only being who is self-existent from everlasting to everlasting, as Moses says in Psalm 90, verses 1 and 2. Now, that's not just something that is accidentally thrown in. That is absolutely central to the things that we need to believe. We may not be able, as Trevor said, and I agree 100%. Trevor, let me say I disagree just a little bit. I don't find it hard to wrap my mind around that. I find it impossible to wrap my mind around the fact that God is eternal. It has no beginning and no end. It's just something that my mind cannot comprehend. Because everything that we know, everything that we're familiar with by our senses, is something that began, something will end. Trevor illustrated that by birth and death, and that, of course, gives an excellent illustration. Everything that we know, everything in the material universe, has a beginning and an end. And everything except God had a beginning, but God had no beginning. Now, not only is that something we must believe because it's one of those things revealed about the nature of God, but it's one of the things that make our faith satisfying as far as understanding the world around us. Atheists who do not believe in God try to come up with an explanation of where the natural universe came from. Now, they believe the universe is all there is to it. And so the physical universe to them is what we would scientifically call a closed system. Well, think about this. In science, energy cannot either be created or destroyed. It can only be changed from one form to another. And another thing we need to consider, that's, by the way, the first law of thermodynamics. Another thing we need to consider is that in a closed system, energy tends to run down, usable energy. Things tend to disorder rather than order. If you're driving down the highway, you don't stop and let gasoline out of your tank. You have to pull over to a service station and put some more gasoline in. Usable energy was taken up, either by the motion or by heat, as you travel down the highway. That's the second law of thermodynamics. Those are the two most basic laws of the science of physics. Now, think about that from the standpoint of the existence of the universe. Where did the universe come from? According to atheists, it came from a big bang. That doesn't tell us anything. All that does is push the problem further back. How did the Big Bang come about? There had to be energy there. Where did that energy come from? And how did that energy get more organized rather than less organized? That's an impossibility in natural physics. Second law of thermodynamics. Things are running down. They're not getting more orderly. But we have an orderly universe, and somehow it had to begin. And when I say it's an orderly universe, let me just simply illustrate that. Anywhere that man has been able to send probes into the universe, I'll give an example of the Explorer satellites that were sent out in the 1970s by the United States. And they've already traveled outside the solar system. And everywhere they went, you know, the law of gravity was in force. They were attracted to the planet, so they could use that as a means to direct themselves. And the way that they were able to direct those satellites was by the fact that the laws of science, the laws of physics, the laws of chemistry apply equally everywhere that we've been able to go, everywhere we've been able to probe in the universe. There's nothing that is disorderly as far as not being a part of the laws of science. And so where did the universe get its orderliness come from? In all of the amazing complexity. The complexity of the universe is mind-boggling, but it's orderly. It operates according to discoverable laws that always operate. A Big Bang does not explain anything. A Big Bang is nonsense. There had to be something behind it that had the intelligence to design it. Something behind it that was eternally existent, so that we don't have to explain where he came from. He's always been there. Something with infinite intelligence to explain the order in the complexity that we see in the universe. And something that had will, because he had something he wanted to accomplish. Now, if we put together all of those traits, infinite power, infinite intelligence, eternal self-existence, will. Now, what do you call that thing? I call that being God, because that's what the Bible calls him. And that's the only logical explanation for where the universe came from. So the matter of God just being there, God being eternally self-existent, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. It's not just something that's unimportant. It's absolutely the only possible way that we can explain the existence of an orderly universe. The atheist has no logical explanation. All he can do is push the problem further back. He still hasn't solved the problem. To put it very simply, which came first, the chicken or the egg? I know which came first. God created the chicken. But an atheist doesn't know. He cannot explain that. Okay, Trevor, I'll stop there and turn it back to you.
That was good stuff. I like that. That was really good. Well, I'm going to shift gears just a little bit. I want to go to a passage in Micah chapter 5. This passage is about Jesus Christ, who is God. And Jesus Christ is spoken of here well in advance before his birth as him coming and being a ruler. And I think this is important to note. I'm going to read verse 2. This is Micah 5:2. He says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of you shall come forth to me the one to be ruler in Israel, whose goings forth are from old, from everlasting." And there's that term that we saw earlier in Psalm 90, everlasting. Now here, this is a reference very clearly to Jesus Christ, who was born in Bethlehem. And there you have verse 2, Bethlehem being made mention of. And out of that place would come a ruler, the ruler of Israel. And he says his going forth are from old, from everlasting. So this is a reference to Jesus Christ, who is God, who is eternal, who comes from everlasting to everlasting. Now, consider that he is a ruler, and come over, if you would, to Hebrews chapter 13, and we'll kind of discuss these together, these two texts. But Hebrews chapter 13, and in verse 8, that says of Jesus Christ, he is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Now, what I like about combining these two texts and looking at them together is that when we consider the idea of God being just there, God existing, yes, God is eternal. He is from everlasting to everlasting. He's always been, always will be. And when we think of Jesus Christ as being our ruler, he's the ruler of all the earth. He's the ruler of his kingdom, the kingdom of Jesus Christ, which, if you're curious on how to be a member of the kingdom of Jesus Christ, that'd be a good question for the program to submit to us. We could talk about those things. But the kingdom of Jesus Christ, Christ is over his kingdom. And here is a ruler that comes from everlasting and is everlasting. And verse 8 of Hebrews says he's the same yesterday, today, forever. This is a comforting thought to me, because we have rulers and leaders are going to disappoint. They're going to disappoint us at times. They're going to make decisions that are maybe unrighteous or even detrimental to us or to our health potentially. Those things are all possible. But Jesus Christ is a ruler that you can depend on. And Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, forever. So to me, that's a very comforting thought, that I serve a ruler and leader, Jesus Christ, who is not going to go back on his word, who's not going to change or make any changes to the things he's given us and the promises that he's made to us. Those stand for all of time, because Jesus Christ does not change. So that portion of him being there in Micah 5, being a ruler and an everlasting ruler, and one who comes from everlasting. To me, that's a very comforting thought, that yes, God is there and God is unchanging. Keith, I'll kick it back to you.
Thanks so much, Trevor. Good information that you've given there, and I appreciate the things that you said. I want to continue with this matter of the self-existence of God. From everlasting to everlasting, your God, as Moses said and Trevor read in Psalm 90, verse 1. That is the argument that on the existence of God and the proof for the existence of God, the evidence for His existence, is certainly not original with me. The first place I know that it was stated is by David in Psalm 19, verse 1, where David said, "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows His handiwork." And so when you see the skies above us, when you see the sun, the moon, and the stars that David could see by the naked eye, that now scientists with the powerful telescopes that we have today can see so far, far out into the universe, when you see all of those heavenly bodies, when you see their existence, their enormity, their complexity, and yet their orderly arrangement, how they operate according to laws that scientists can discover and can teach to people in science classes, that you have to stand amazed, you have to stand in awe of a God who's so powerful, who's been eternally existent, and who has will, who has such incredible intelligence. Of course, we know that He's all-knowing. God is all-wise. When we consider all of those things as evidence of Him, look how the Apostle Paul states it in Romans chapter 1. In Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 18, the Apostle Paul is showing that the Gentiles needed the saving power of the gospel. And if you would read Romans chapter 1, beginning of verse 18, going to the end of the chapter, verse 32, that it sounds like the Apostle Paul is describing modern-day America, how people have given up the knowledge of God and turned to gross immorality. And that's what the ancient Gentiles had done in Paul's day, and that's what most Americans have done today, turned away from God and have turned to the grossest of immorality. The Apostle Paul describes that. The same thing's going on today in Romans chapter 1. But notice he says that they are without excuse. And that's even more so today, because the Gentiles did not have a special revelation of God's will to them that we have in the Scriptures, that the Jews had in the Old Testament, we have in the complete Bible. So the Gentiles didn't have that, but they had the universe. They had the world around them that they could see. And even by the existence of the universe, there was no excuse for them rejecting the knowledge of God. I want to read Romans chapter 1, beginning in verse 19, down through verse 21. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them. For God has shown it to them. In some way, God showed Himself to the Gentiles who did not have the Scriptures. They had no special revelation from God. Well, how did He show Himself to them? For since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes are clearly seen. Now there is a difficult statement. How can I clearly see what is invisible? He's not talking about this eye. He's talking about the eye of my mind. What I see with my eye, I have to have an explanation for, and I have to see that with the eye of my mind. Are clearly seen, being understood. See, he explains himself there. It's the understanding. Being understood by the things that are made. When I see the things that God made, when I observe around me the beauty of nature upon this earth, when I observe around me the stars, the sun, the moon, and the orderly operation, the sun always comes up in a predictable and an orderly way. Do you look to the west to see the sun come up in the morning? If you do, we've got big problems. No, the sun always comes up, and we know when it will come up. You can have a chart that shows when the sun will come up, the orderly operation of the universe in which we live. Then when we see these things being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power, it took infinite power to bring about this great universe. And Godhead, his divine attributes, his attributes of eternal existence, his attributes of wisdom that is beyond comprehension, his attribute of infinite wisdom, and will to bring these things about. He had will. All of those things argue the existence of God so that they're without excuse. Here's his point. Well, let me read down through verse 21. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile, that is, useless in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. You take the smartest PhD scientist in the United States or in the world, and if that scientist is an atheist, his thoughts are useless. They're futile. They're leading him away from reality instead of to reality. We would say he's detached from reality. That's, by the way, describing a person who's insane. He is spiritually and intellectually insane. He's detached from reality because when he sees the material universe, he does not see those divine attributes of God, which is the only logical explanation for the existence of the universe, and therefore he cannot glorify God as God because he's turning himself to things that are useless and things that will only destroy him both spiritually and physically. And so God, the self-existent God, the eternal God from everlasting to everlasting, is the only logical explanation. Well, Trevor, we have a couple of minutes left in the program. Why don't you finish the thoughts for us today, please?
Well, sure. I'd like to go to a passage briefly in Psalm 139. This is the Psalm of David. And beginning in verse 7, David says, "Where can I go from your spirit, or where can I flee from your presence? If I ascend into heaven, you are there. If I make my bed in hell, behold, you are there." He's talking about the place of death. Now, this is talking about God. David's talking about God and how God is everywhere. "If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there your hand shall lead me, and your right hand shall hold me. If I say, surely the darkness shall fall on me, even the night shall be light about me. Indeed, the darkness shall not hide from you, but the night shines as the day. The darkness and the light are both alike to you." And he continues on from there, and it's actually a very interesting read because he talks about how God formed him in the womb. And God does indeed create us and form us and gives life. Now, the reason I bring us to this text, the question was about God just being there, his existence. And part of his existence is that he is everywhere. And again, that's something that's very difficult for you and I to wrap our minds around because, or Keith might say impossible, but difficult because we can only be in one place at one time, right? I can't be at two places at once. We say that a lot of times, kind of jokingly. But the fact is we can't do it. God can, and God does. God is everywhere. And that's very difficult, again, to wrap our minds around. But it also is helpful in understanding when he teaches us other passages, like in Hebrews chapter 13, which we don't have time to go to, but where he tells his people that he will never leave them nor forsake them. Well, God has people all over this earth. Keith goes down and preaches in Africa, and there are members of the church down there. How can God be with all these people? Well, because here in the Psalm, David tells us he is everywhere, and he can be everywhere at once. And again, difficult for us to understand, but nonetheless true. And again, a comforting thought that if we are one of God's children doing his will, then God never leaves us, never forsakes us, and he is always with us. We appreciate you so much joining us this evening. We hope you join us next week.
Thank you for watching Search the Scriptures. If you have a Bible question or comment, you may call 870-321-5746, email keithsharp@suddenlink.net, or write Keith Sharp at P.O. Box 263, Mountain Home, Arkansas 72654. And your question will be answered on the air. Be sure to watch next week at the same time for another edition of Search the Scriptures. Until then, the Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace.